So let me just try to address as quickly as I can the subject matter that I was asked to speak about this morning, which is Ireland's mitigation challenge to 2020. And what I thought I'd do is just give you a brief introduction to it, talk a little bit about the EU climate change package, our own Environmental Protection Agency emission projections. I'm going to speak a very small bit about the emissions trading scheme, and then the key sources, which is really where the challenge is, on the non-emissions trading emissions, and then just summarise. So I don't think, I just put this here for the record really, because I'm sure that everybody in this room is very familiar with the context in which we are trying to deal with climate change. You can go back as far as you like, but I chose to go back to 1992, when the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which was adopted in Rio de Janeiro. The Kyoto Protocol in 1997 at COP3 adopted legally binding targets with sanctions attached. But the ratification process took 7 years, following the ratification process, it took 7 years for the Kyoto Protocol to come into force. So I suppose what I'm saying is that we're now at COP15, and if we make an agreement at COP15, it's really essential that it doesn't take as long to come into force again, and that's a big if we can get that agreement. Kyoto was a very important agreement and protocol, envisaging that national measures would be enacted as the primary method of achieving emissions targets. So in other words, putting the responsibility on individual countries. The protocol also does offer international market-based strategies, and these are around the emissions trading system, the clean development mechanism, and joint implementation. A roadmap was established at COP13 in Bali. That has led to a 2-year process to finalise a legally binding agreement beyond 2012. Whether we reach a legally binding agreement in Copenhagen is not for me to say right now, but from an environmental point of view and from a climate change point of view, it is essential that we do it as quickly as possible. Time is of the essence here. Let me just show you one slide. There are millions and millions of slides, I know, as you know, to talk about climate change, but Gay Mitchell this morning said that there are some members of the European Parliament who still don't believe that climate change is happening, and they're no different to communities that in other places in the world. I just saw a survey yesterday saying that 47% of US people don't believe that climate change is happening either. So we're talking to the converted here. I guess that people here in this room already know that climate change is happening, but the science is unequivocal on the subject. I'll show you 2 graphs there to show you how the climate, the facts are as they are. Greenhouse gas emissions from human activities have affected global warming since the middle of the 20th century, and within the next 10 to 15 years, our greenhouse gas emissions need to be shifted to a pathway consistent with the 2-degree target above pre-industrial levels to avoid dangerous climate change. And Christian has very eloquently pointed out this morning that 2-degree is an average global temperature, and in some areas of the world it will be much more than 2 degrees, and with much more catastrophic consequences. So climate change is happening already, and the EPA produced very recently a report a synthesised report on the impacts that climate change. It's a collation of the science in the area for Ireland, and the effects are very clear. So the leadership role of the EU has long been at the forefront of international efforts to combat climate change, and while it may seem that this is not fast enough for many areas of the world who are seeing the climate change quicker than we are, nevertheless the EU has adopted a leadership role of which we should be and are, I think, rightly proud, and we need to keep that going. The EU played a key role in the development of the UNFCCC in 1992 and in the protocol agreed in Kyoto in 1997. In January 2007, the Commission set out proposals and options for an ambitious global agreement, and in 2008 the Commission proposed a major package of climate and energy related legislative proposals to implement the commitments and targets. If you look at that climate change and energy package, the EU is committed to reducing its overall emissions to at least 20% below 1990 levels by 2020. and it will scale up this reduction to 30% if other developed countries commit to comparable cuts. And this was agreed in the package. The EU has also agreed to increase the share of renewables in energy use to 20% by 2020 and to reduce energy consumption by 20% of projected 2020 levels by improving energy efficiencies. So that is for the whole of Europe, and then those targets spin out to the various countries within the European family. The four elements of it are just represented on that slide there. Emissions trading is one element of the scheme. I won't, just in the interest of time, I won't go into the individual details. Renewable energy, the non-emission trading sector emissions have to be dealt with, and then there's carbon capture and storage. And they're the four pillars, if you like, of that package that was agreed. I'm going to just focus a little bit on the emissions trading scheme and how Ireland has implemented it. The EU emissions trading scheme, first of all, is based on four principles. It's a cap and trade system. Participation is mandatory for businesses in the sectors that are covered. It contains a very strong compliance framework, and it taps into emission reduction opportunities in the rest of the world by accepting credits from emission-saving projects carried out under the Kyoto Protocol's Clean Development Mechanism, the CDM as it's known, and Joint Implementation Instrument, JI. And that gives an opportunity to fund and support projects that are taking place in the developing areas of the world. Those projects need to be ratified and approved by the UN. In Ireland, the emissions trading scheme, there are 104 installations covered, and there you see the figures of verified emissions. The Environmental Protection Agency administers this scheme. We developed the original national allocation plan and the second plan, and regulate these industries in this way. We verify the emissions from the companies involved, and what we've seen is a year-on-year reduction in emissions from these 104 or thereabouts companies. Now, I wouldn't get too complacent about that either, because the scope of the scheme can change a bit as installations close and new ones open, etc. But nevertheless, we see a downward trend here. It's not immediate. You can't immediately attribute that to the scheme, but we think that the scheme is certainly having a role there. Ireland is one of the few countries that didn't over-allocate allowances to the companies that it regulates here. In 2008, for example, we gave a free allocation of 19.97 million tonnes, and the emissions were more than that. So we're there or thereabouts on that. The revised EU emissions trading scheme is a new scheme coming out, and now there will be one EU-wide cap to cover the whole of the EU. Instead of 27 national caps, it will be administered from the European Union instead of from Ireland. It will run for 8 years, from 2013 to 2020. We're getting ready to move our system into it. The cap will decrease along a linear trend, so in other words, companies will be getting less allowances every year, so that the emissions trading scheme emissions are reduced 21% by 2020 relative to 2005. So there you have so the emissions have to come down or use the CDM and JI mechanisms to account for that. From 2012 onwards, the ETS will be expanded to include emissions from air flights to and from European airports. So there has been a call in the past for aviation to be brought in, and it is being brought in. So that's all decided at European level. I want to move on to the non-ETS sector emissions. The target for Ireland for non-ETS sectors, and these are the ones that are not covered under that emissions trading scheme, so everything except the 109 companies that I spoke about, or 104 companies, however many are in it, so the target here is to reduce emissions by 20% in 2020 relative to 2005 levels, calculated by the EU Commission as 37.9 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's calculated on the basis of a figure that the EPA has gathered and sent into the EU, all verified emissions by a very stringent collection mechanism, and it's all audited, etc. It's highly likely in these at this stage that forest sinks will be included in the member state compliance regimes, and that is important for Ireland, and I'll show you a graph to show you why in a moment. The outcome of Copenhagen, or later, but we would hope it would be Copenhagen, will provide absolute certainty about the sinks and compliance. So we still wonder, we still don't know whether sinks are in, but we think so. I just want to move on to EPA emission projections now. Another one of the tasks that we carry out as an environmental protection agency is to develop emissions projections for the Irish government. They also go to the EU. We do this annually for the past couple of years. It's a relatively new task that we've had. It allows the most recent policy developments and key assumptions on economic growth to be taken into account in terms of deciding what policies will be in the future. And the projections I'm going to show you were published in March of this year, and they assume an 8% contraction in GDP between 2008 and 2010, with a resumption of growth thereafter. That was the best figures we had at that time. When we do our more up-to-date projections, which will be published in March 2010, we'll be using the next set of figures, and the contraction may be even bigger than 8% at that stage. I haven't got the figure. So there's the graph that shows the black on the left-hand side here are actual published figures that we've already published for the years up to 2007. And the projections then are in the blue. You see 2010, 2015 and 2020. The dashed line across is our 2020 target. So you see that these are projections based, I'll show you the assumptions that underline it now in a moment, but the key point here is that even at our most optimistic projections at the moment, with all policies being adopted and all having the effects that they're supposed to have, we'll still have a gap of 2.7 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2020. So we won't meet, on current projections, our 2020 EU targets at that time. If forest sinks are not included, that goes up by another 4 million tonnes, so it'll be about 7 million tonnes. But we're assuming for the purposes of this that carbon sinks are included. The key assumptions underlying those projections are that the policies and measures from the National Energy Efficiency Action Plan, drawn up here in Ireland, the Energy White Paper and the National Climate Change Strategy are all built into those projections. What we've assumed is that all existing and planned policies and measures will be adopted and fully implemented on time, and that they will achieve the full emissions reductions anticipated, and that carbon sinks are allowed, as I said. Now, they're pretty big assumptions. I'm going to just move on now to the key sources of non-ETS emissions, because this is where the big challenges for Ireland lie. Agriculture and transport combined account for about 70% of Ireland's total non-ETS sector emissions, so that's non-industrial, in 2020. These are two sectors in which it's very difficult to achieve cost-effective emission reductions. The residential sector emissions, alongside those, account for about 14% of non-ETS sector emissions. It's easier to, there are measures you can take that will, energy efficiency in particular, that can impact there. And then industry and services outside of the ETS and waste make up the remainder. So 70% between agriculture and transport is a very important number. If you look at the transport side of things first, mitigating transport demand is a very complex task which requires an integrated package of policies and measures. I think we all know that. You just have to look at the traffic around Dublin. How did you get here? How do we get to work? How do we go about our normal lives? A lot of it has to do with transport. The measures that are put in place to deal with this issue include the provision of high-quality public transport. Now, we have made huge inroads in the capital city here in terms of that, but there's still a way to go. We need to manage demand for transport, and I just say such as congestion charging, but there are other demand management tools as well. And encouraging the uptake of more fuel-efficient vehicles, and that could include electric vehicles in the future, and should include probably electric vehicles in the future. And I know there are plans afoot for that, but it is some way in the future. I don't think we're going to see a huge penetration of electric cars on the streets in the next year or two, or 10. It's also important to focus on decoupling transport demand from economic activity to improve environmental performance. during the recovery which we expect, because I think probably, when we looked at the graph earlier, that includes an 8% reduction, economic downturn, if you like, over a couple of years. It is very important that our emissions are not based on a recession. It's important that when we begin to recover, that it's a low carbon, low energy recovery that we have. And that, I think, is the real challenge in all the sectors, and transport is no different than any other. We really cannot be in a situation where we're depending on recession to get us out of our international obligations. Moving on to agriculture then, in agriculture and in Ireland and New Zealand, just as another country that is quite similar to Ireland in this, agriculture is the source of a much larger share of greenhouse gas emissions than in most other developed countries. It's around 27% here in Ireland. The technical opportunities for reducing agricultural emissions are quite limited. I mean, we could talk about agriculture. I'm sure there have been lots of individual seminars about agriculture, but just in the time that I have, this is what I can tell you. The McKinsey report, which was developed by SEI, or commissioned by SEI, it highlights opportunities in relation to improved grassland management. It developed cost curves for the measures that people could take in terms of reducing emissions. There aren't that many. There's no silver bullet on the agriculture side. There's no silver bullet that will reduce methane from cattle or nitrous oxide either. There are a number of additional novel technologies, and we are supporting research, and I know the Department of Agriculture is supporting research in terms of reducing emissions here. But it's small reductions you're talking about. There isn't actually anything really well enough developed at this stage to deliver real savings in the agriculture sector. So in summary then, Ireland really faces big challenges and challenging targets for the non-ETS sector emissions in 2020, and particularly in transport and agriculture. We are, as you see from the graph, projected to exceed our 2020 target by 3 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent, even if all the measures deliver and the carbon sinks are allowed. And that is a big if. Transport and agriculture, as I say, are responsible for 70% and are very tough nuts to crack. At least in transport, there is some light at the end of the tunnel, in that there are technologies that can do it, and public transport and different modes of transport, you could see that it might be able to happen. Agriculture is very difficult. There are big policy decisions and difficult choices here. I mean, I don't think anybody is suggesting that we want to destroy the agricultural economy that we have, and yet from the figures, from the facts, are that agriculture is contributing a lot. So I think in terms of looking into the future, we have decisions to make about whether there other sectors can take up the slack that is there for the agriculture sector. Is that a policy decision that we are able to take? So my last slide is just meeting some of those challenges. We have to continue to press for an international agreement at Copenhagen. At this stage, it's looking as if a legally binding treaty won't come out of Copenhagen, but who knows? The momentum of that many people in that atmosphere in Copenhagen may come up with more than we think at the moment. Nationally, we need a very supportive institutional framework. The climate change bill, which is promised by the Minister for the Environment, may provide the context, should provide the context for this. It will be important that the institutions of the state support this really serious problem, that we actually have institutions that are focused on meeting our international obligations, and maybe even going beyond our international obligations, but dealing with the climate issue. And because it goes across many, many departments, it's very important that we get the institutional framework right here. The EPA has many roles in this area and will continue to play a leadership role in the climate change area, informing and supporting policy development, in producing robust data, inventories and projections, in funding high quality environmental research, which is really, really important in the climate change area. We have funded quite a bit of research in the climate area up to now, and we have been able to make very significant inputs to climate policy through the Department of the Environment and at European and indeed international level by doing so. It's very important that we continue to do that. And of course in supporting government decisions in terms of how the climate change debate is to go on, but more importantly how we are as a country to meet the challenges that I've laid out for you today. Thank you very much. I hope I was quick.